The earliest version you might have heard suggests that giraffes' necks grew long so they could eat leaves from tall trees, and thus, giraffes with longer necks were naturally selected. However, a more recent scientific explanation tells you that giraffes fight by swinging their necks, and individuals with longer necks are more likely to stand out and leave offspring. Both of these explanations are actually incomplete, because the behind-the-scenes story of the incredibly long necks of modern giraffes is a complex past that's beyond your imagination. The story begins approximately 25 million years ago, at the end of the Oligocene epoch. At this time, a cold climate that had lasted for about 8 million years seemed to be coming to an end. The Antarctic ice sheet completely melted again, and the entire Earth was entering a warm period known as the late Oligocene warming. Consequently, forests and jungles that were originally concentrated in tropical and subtropical regions began to expand significantly into temperate zones. Parallel to this expansion was the proliferation of various small animals beneath the dense vegetation. Among these were the artiodactyls, or more precisely, the ruminants, while from our current hindsight perspective we know that these ruminants later evolved into the most dominant group of herbivorous animals on Earth today. At that time, ruminants showed no potential whatsoever to challenge the then flourishing perissodactyls like horses and rhinoceroses. This is because early ruminants were mostly small animals, typically no larger than a cat, and their form was somewhat similar to what is commonly known today as mouse deer or chèvretins. In fact, their early ruminant relatives likely began their unique digestive process of rumination because their small bodies simply couldn't accommodate an extensive intestinal tract. To thoroughly digest plant matter with cell walls, they had no choice but to have food double back multiple times for redigestion. This hobby of rumination, however, unexpectedly led these animals toward an evolutionary tendency for larger body sizes. Fighting. While large herbivores like horses often rely on their sheer bulk in conflicts, when it comes to serious combat, having specialized weapons is a natural progression. Early ruminant skirmishes primarily involved mutual biting. Consequently, they all began to strengthen their canine teeth. More aggressive species even extended these teeth until they protruded outside the mouth, forming tusks, much like those seen in modern-day musk deer. The improvement of these weapons, in turn, stimulated advancements in defense. To avoid having their eyes, ears, or other vulnerable head areas punctured by tusks during mutual biting, these ruminants began to strengthen their skulls. They developed various protrusions on their heads, which would effectively deflect incoming tusks. These protrusions later evolved into the iconic horns and antlers of large ruminants today. This explains why almost all large ruminants today are irritable, horned creatures, hence their classification as pecora. This seems to have predetermined the fate of this remarkable family over the next tens of millions of years. Originally, in forests, tender leaves near the ground were limited, and being too large would hinder movement through the trees. For a long time, the body size of these ruminants was therefore restricted. However, the Oligocene epoch suddenly disrupted this environmental balance that had lasted for millions of years. Suddenly, the boundary between forests and plains became blurred. At the expanding edge of the woodlands, vast grasslands with sparse shrubs often emerged, granting ruminants a buffer zone to step out of their comfort zone. The first group of large ruminants to break away from the pecora and become the first generation of large ruminants was precisely the group to which our protagonist today belongs, the Giraffoidea superfamily. Frankly, early giraffes still looked relatively normal. For example, the Canthumeryx civalensis, which lived approximately 20 million years ago, looked very much like a modern antelope. Coincidentally, at this time, as the African continent continuously pressed northeast, the West Asian region, which was originally a series of islands and shallow seas, gradually uplifted to become a complete landmass. These early giraffes naturally became the pioneering inhabitants of this region, enjoying the first wave of environmental benefits, but even with new territory, the ancestral tradition of fighting could not change. Thus, we see that early giraffes not only increased significantly in size, but their horns also rapidly became more complex. Slightly later than Canthumeryx civalensis, species like Samotherium and Paleotragus which lived over 10 million years ago in the Miocene epoch, all evolved very deer-like antlers. However, as their attributes continuously improved, these early giraffes suddenly realized a big problem. Ouch, that hurts. The antlers of modern deer and horns of cattle that we are familiar with are basically made of bone or keratin, purely external structures that can be freely used without much sensation. But the ancestors of giraffes, as they grew larger, seemed to overlook this issue. Their horns were still covered in skin and grew hair, to the extent that even today, we often don't realize it. What's on a giraffe's head are actually ossicones, which are bony outgrowths covered in skin and hair, and naturally, they contain blood vessels and nerves. So, when the giraffe ancestors' stats were boosted to a certain level, those sharp, deer-like antlers smashing down on each other's heads were not only excruciatingly painful but could also cause infected wounds, leading to potential death. This was a bit too costly during breeding season, wasn't it? Consequently, within the giraffe lineage, some species that gave up their sharp antlers actually came out ahead in the evolutionary arms race and became dominant. The ultimate result of this evolutionary path is this creature right here. Behold my iron head, due to its truly astounding appearance. When a research team from the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, IVPP, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences first discovered its fossils in 1996. They were initially clueless, even calling it a monster. It took 27 years and multiple transfers between researchers before paleontologists finally confirmed that this was an early giraffe species that lived approximately 17 million years ago. And, perhaps, it represents the direct ancestral form of modern giraffes at that time, thus filling a crucial gap in the evolutionary history of giraffes. The monster suddenly became a divine beast. So, these paleontologists gave it a rather mystical name, Discochryx shiegi. Most importantly, this animal, in order to prevent snapping its neck during intense fights, also highly specialized its cervical vertebrae structure, allowing for the attachment of much thicker muscles and ligaments. We now know that this laid the foundational structural basis for the later long neck. But at the time, this strong neck indeed gave rise to a whole new fighting style, which I'll call the headbutting school. Simply put, it involved abandoning high-speed collisions and instead directly locking heads, relying on neck and body strength to push the opponent back. Hey, a master's duel is all about internal power. The problem, however, was that a smooth, bald patch like that on Discochryx shiegi was prone to slipping during headbutting. So, evolution pushed some early giraffes to flatten their foreheads and add small protrusions to increase friction. Take, for instance, Quaggalina, which lived 10 to 20 million years ago. Oh, this name is another example of scientists being playful. During the Ming Dynasty, Zheng He's fleet brought giraffes back to China and they were called qilin, a mythical creature. As a wonderful cultural legacy, we Chinese typically refer to most ancient giraffes with names ending in ling today. Building on this Quaggalina model, subsequent early giraffes continuously increased the complexity of these protrusions until, during headbutting, the two heads could actually interlock. This led to creatures like Giraffes, with numerous horn-like structures on their foreheads. This also largely established the ossicone pattern seen in modern giraffes. With this refined, point-and-stop traditional martial art, the ancestors of giraffes could finally grow in size without restraint. Giraffes, for example, could already reach a weight of 300 kilograms. A giant beast was quietly emerging. The okapi, which belongs to the same Giraffidae family today, largely retains the body structure left by Giraffes. They also still primarily live in forested areas, much like their ancestors of over 10 million years ago. However, approximately 12 million years ago, the Earth's climate began to cool again. The sparse woodlands that had provided cover for the giraffe family started to shrink. Consequently, some giraffes were forced to migrate to more open grasslands. However, it was at this point that the giraffe family realized that becoming a dominant grazer like cattle or horses wasn't as simple as just lowering your head. From our perspective, all herbivores eat plants, but in reality, eating grass and eating tree leaves are two entirely different matters. Tree leaves are relatively rich in nutrients, So the essence of consuming leaves is to digest and absorb the nutrients within the leaf's mesophyll cells. This only requires chewing and digestion to break the cell walls and release the cell contents. Most grasses that grow on the ground, or rather, Poaceae plants, have leaves with relatively scarce nutrients. If an animal is to feed on grass, it's best if it can fully digest and absorb the plant cell walls themselves. This means that the degree of cell wall breakdown must be greatly increased. The problem is, breaking down grass cell walls is no easy feat. The cell walls of Poaceae plants contain large amounts of silica, making them incredibly tough. Furthermore, low-lying plants close to the ground are almost always inevitably contaminated with a lot of sand. Facing these dirty materials, rumination alone was still somewhat insufficient, especially since the giraffe family's ruminant ability was, in fact, only mediocre. Their pizza stomach just couldn't handle hog feed. Precisely at this juncture, a brand new power emerged within the ruminant family, true cattle and sheep, or the Bovidae family. Not only did they evolve more developed digestive tracts than the giraffes, pushing their ruminant abilities to the extreme, but they also emulated their old rivals, the perissodactyls, like donkeys and horses, by evolving high-crowned teeth capable of effectively processing tough grass. They instantly became the most dominant group of herbivores on Earth. The most common cattle, sheep, antelopes, wildebeest, and other animals we see on grasslands today all belong to this group. The strong emergence of the Bovidae family completely blocked any possibility for giraffes to evolve into grass-eating ecological niches. Alright, if the grasslands are so competitive, I'll just go back to the forest then, thought the giraffes. But upon turning around, they realized that their crystal had been stolen by friendly forces. Yes, I'm talking about the deer family. Deer teeth and digestive tracts are broadly intermediate between those of bovids and giraffes. This gives them a wider range of food consumption, allowing them to outcompete giraffes in many situations. Consequently, deer are often better adapted to the plant-rich environments of forests. Caught between these two dominant groups, the giraffe family found itself unable to advance or retreat. At this point, there was essentially only one path left for giraffes: getting bigger. After all, the giraffe family already had the largest body size among them. Therefore, only they could dominate the relatively taller leaves on the West African savannas, leaves that were too difficult for the not yet so large cattle and sheep of the time to reach. Thus, between approximately 14.6 to 3.4 million years ago, the Sametherium in southern Europe already stood over 2 meters tall and weighed around half a ton. More crucially, as they fed on higher leaves more frequently, and to avoid wasting energy and effort by standing up their entire body for every meal, the necks of these ancient giraffes already showed a clear tendency to lengthen. The neck length of Sametherium, for instance, was already intermediate between that of an okapi and a modern giraffe. However, enormous body size, in turn, made various resources even scarcer, intensifying competition among giraffes. But this risked reverting to the old path of determining dominance through deadly battles. Therefore, under evolutionary pressure, some ancient giraffes chose a path of diplomatic rather than militant combat. Frankly, this evolutionary strategy has a long history within the giraffe family. For instance, approximately 16 million years ago, a creature emerged that exemplified this. I bet its name is Boliling, you might think. Actually, it's called Prolobitherium. Their ossicones showed clear sexual dimorphism. The female's ossicones were relatively normal, but the male's ossicones, resembling a giant bow tie, were most likely not used for fighting. Instead, they were for display. Behold, how I preen and strut before the enemy lines, making them surrender without a fight. Around 10 million years ago, this evolutionary path reached its peak with the majestic Civetharini, also known as civethares, which once roamed across Eurasia and Africa. Besides the classic Civetherium, this group included creatures like Vishnetherium and Brahmatherium. Unfortunately, they soon met their twilight of the gods. Approximately 5 million years ago, during the Pliocene epoch, temperatures finally dropped below a critical point. From then on, the Afro-Eurasian savannas began a sustainable collapse. But the most crucial factor wasn't the temperature drop itself, but the underlying reason, a decrease in carbon dioxide. From that time forward, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations on Earth repeatedly fell below the 0.027% mark. At such low CO2 levels, a significant portion of the Earth's plants would have their photosynthesis disrupted due to insufficient carbon dioxide. However, one type of plant was an exception: C4 plants. Simply put, these plants construct a closed reaction vessel within their leaves using thick bundle sheath cells. Simultaneously, they've also developed a system that you can think of as being able to concentrate carbon dioxide. C4 plants actively transport raw materials for photosynthesis into this reaction vessel and quickly remove the oxygen and organic matter produced by the reaction. This allows them to tolerate very low concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Furthermore, C4 plants are generally tougher than other plants. The aggressive expansion of these plants ultimately spelled doom for the giraffe family. From the geological record, giraffes, which were once widely distributed across Eurasia and Africa, suddenly disappeared around 5 million years ago. Fortunately, perhaps because deer generally don't tolerate heat well, the remaining giraffes managed to temporarily stabilize their populations in South Asia and Africa. However, the extreme scarcity of survival resources remained an undeniable fact. Perhaps it was under this extreme survival pressure that the giraffe family's body size underwent a final, explosive growth. The last giraffes in Asia. And indeed the last of the civethares, like the gigantic megasaurops, a type of civethere that persisted in the Himalayan foothills, likely stood as tall as 3 meters and weighed over a ton. Unfortunately, simply getting bigger was ultimately just a slow death. These magnificent giant civethares vanished forever after a brief encounter with migrating Homo sapiens several thousand years ago. Meanwhile, their close relatives in Africa weren't faring much better. Even today, deer haven't been able to establish a significant presence in Africa. Yet, simply being outcompeted by increasingly larger cattle and sheep made life difficult enough. Their feeding height was forced to increase again and again. Consequently, the necks of these early African giraffes were already longer than those of the earlier Sametherium. These were the Paleotragus species, living over 7 million years ago, and their appearance was already almost that of a miniature modern giraffe. They could grow up to 4.5 meters tall, yet weighed only around 700 kilograms. Thus, the giraffe in its strict sense, meaning the genus Giraffe, formally entered the stage of history. Around 5 million years ago, after the bloodbath within the giraffe family began, competition among themselves became a desperate fight for survival, leaving no room for restraint. Consequently, these giraffes reverted to a more aggressive fighting style. However, their body shape at this point was clearly no longer suited for the headbutting method. So, they unlocked a new combat style, which I'll call the sparring school. Simply put, it involved using their strong, powerful, and robust necks to whip and strike each other. From then on, the body size of these giraffes also began to soar. The giraffe Jumi, living approximately 4.5 million years ago, was noticeably more robust. While its height increased to 5 meters, its weight reached about 900 kilograms. It is also very likely the most recent common ancestor of modern giraffes. Today, besides the okapi, there are only 4 extant species of giraffe in the world. Their heights generally exceed 5 meters, and their weight can easily surpass 1 ton, making them the tallest land animals on Earth. However, their feeding habits are still essentially consistent with those of the Paleotragus from over 7 million years ago, primarily focusing on leaves 3 to 4 meters off the ground. For this, they even frequently and deliberately lower their heads and flatten their necks when eating. It can only be said that the height of today's giraffes clearly exceeds their actual needs. They look down upon all other creatures, like a group of spirits in farewell. Okay, that's all for today. Please like the video, comment and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thank you very much.